Thanks for listening in to the latest in the Sydney Institute's virtual talks at a time of pandemic. And today we have two well-known speakers to talk about the topic of the economic and moral dimensions of pandemic when Australia is at a time of lockdown. So our two speakers are Adam Creighton. He commenced his career at the Reserve Bank of Australia. He'd studied at the University of New South Wales and subsequently at Oxford University. He worked as a speechwriter for Tony Abbott and for 8 years at the Australian, is currently the Australian's economics editor. And Parnell McGuinness. McGuinness lived and worked in Germany, working in business and in policy. In Australia, back home, running a business and policy communications firm, and of course a prominent columnist for the Australian Financial Review. So we'll start off with Adam, we'll go to Parnell, and then we'll have questions and discussion. And thanks to our members who've sent in some questions for today. Adam.
Well, thank you, Jared, for that kind introduction, and of course to the Sydney Institute for having me today. But you asked me to talk about how we might or should emerge economically from this unprecedented period of lockdown, which of course formally started to unwind across Australia last week. But I can't resist first giving a few more general remarks about where we find ourselves now. About a month ago, I wrote a column that caused a minor furore, where I wrote the response to the virus is starting to appear to be a damaging overreaction. Well, I think it's no longer starting to appear that way. In the months since, I think it's become clearer and clearer that it was a significant overreaction. In March, extreme responses were understandable given the great fog of uncertainty, but the fog soon cleared in my view, and as we approach June, they are not reasonable now, especially in Australia. As I say, it's almost June, and the Queensland Premier is even considering banning her own people from crossing the New South Wales until September. Extraordinary stuff. I think when historians come to evaluate this year in many decades' time, I doubt they will spend much time looking at the virus itself. I do think certainly it's more likely to be seen as the Great Panic of 2020, more than the Great Pandemic of 2020. Since we went into lockdown in late March, about 21,000 Australians have died of various reasons, yet only the 100 who've passed away from coronavirus have received any public attention. For the first time ever, deaths in nursing homes have become a gripping national story. And all this, of course, has only pushed politicians into very extreme measures for fear of being blamed for any deaths at all. Now, globally, the situation, of course, is more tragic. The coronavirus has killed around 320,000 people. But it's worth pointing out, for historical context, that if it ends up killing twice that number, it will have killed far fewer people than the lethal flu pandemics of the late 1950s and 1960s, which each killed around 1 million people globally. And of course, that's when the world's population was roughly half what it is today. And in neither of those pandemics did the world deliberately inflict such extraordinary economic damage on itself. Now, the modelling that underpinned the response, both here in Australia, was grossly pessimistic. Sweden, for instance, was told that if it didn't lock down just as the UK had, 40,000 people would have died by the 1st of May and 100,000 by June. Well, it's almost June, of course, and 3,500 people have died in Sweden. So those models, which of course played such a critical role in guiding public policy into the crisis, were clearly finished. Closer to home, the Victorian government told us that 36,000 people would die in that state alone without lockdown. Now, that's more even than died during the Spanish flu a century ago, which was a far, far more lethal disease. And US states that have opened up early against advice, such as Georgia and Florida, have not experienced the huge surge in COVID-related deaths yet that were predicted by these models. And one other aspect of the overreaction that I'd like to touch on was this blanket shutdown by age across all locations. We surely could have had more targeted restrictions in a much better way. Around 5% of the deaths in Sweden were of people aged under 60, and the median age of death in Europe is in the low 80s, which of course exceeds life expectancy in most countries. Now consider this, out of the 29,690 total COVID deaths in Italy, just 332 were of people aged under 50. And of course, Italy is a large country, and many people under 50 tragically die every year without the slightest public interest in the press. Now, quite aside from the unprecedented restrictions on our freedoms, for coming up to 8 weeks now, the financial cost has been huge. So, Kevin Rudd was extremely heavily criticised as Prime Minister for his $42 billion stimulus package. The government and the Reserve Bank, now combined, have embarked on a $330 billion stimulus package this time. Extraordinary. The debate about the efficacy of lockdowns will continue for many years. There was little, if any, empirical evidence, in my view, for them beforehand, except a few academic studies looking at the Spanish flu a century ago. But I challenge you to look across the world and find a relationship between the number of deaths, and I mean a reliable relationship between the number of deaths and the severity of a lockdown. Sure, Australia and New Zealand have done very well, but if you look at Japan and Korea and Taiwan without mandatory lockdowns, they have also done well too. And similarly throughout Europe, you will not find a reliable relationship. It may well be that other factors mattered far more, such as the climate or being an island, or perhaps we ended up with a less virulent strain in the first place through sheer good fortune. Of course, it seems logical that mandatory lockdowns help reduce the cases and deaths, but the question, of course, is to what extent, given the massive economic and social costs. I doubt very much those future historians will ascribe our success to the unique genius of our state governments. Indeed, the first study in the US to look at the efficacy of lockdowns has found that in a typical US state, they reduced the number of cases, not deaths, the number of cases by 2,150, which of course suggests that they've saved very few deaths indeed, with enormous economic pain. So I wanted to make those points by way of introduction, so you know where I'm coming from with all this. But of course we are where we are now. You know, what's done is done, and so how bad is the economic outlook? Well, internationally, the IMF is expecting the biggest decline in the 1930s. The International Labour Organization says that some 200 million people will soon be out of work. Here, the Reserve Bank only this week, in its latest minutes, said that we're facing the deepest and most rapid contraction in the 60-year history of the national accounts. As you probably know, in Australia, 7.6 million people are either on JobKeeper or JobSeeker. And if you add in public servants across the three levels of government, you end up with some 9.6 million people who are either fully or partly dependent on government for their incomes now. So the official jobless rate, of course, rose to 6.2%, but as I said, in reality, some 72% of the labour force is now dependent on government. This is extraordinary, and no one could possibly have forecast that this could happen. Furthermore, population growth is set to collapse in Australia. The government had penciled in an increase of about 800,000 over the next few years. It's more likely to be zero. Federal and state budgets will come under huge pressure, with some expecting the total debt of those governments to reach $1.5 trillion by next year. That's according to UBS. Of course, the economic costs in poor nations like India and Brazil and Indonesia will be much, much greater than in Western countries because of the pre-existing levels of poverty that they already have. And some indeed fear famines could emerge ultimately if the downturn is severe enough later this year. Now, moving on now to, I guess, the more pressing question is, will we emerge from this quickly? This is the key question, and look, I want to try to be optimistic. There is no historical precedent for this type of recession that we now face. And this is, in fact, our ray of hope, I believe. If you look at other recessions in the early 80s, the early 90s, it took many, many years to recover economically, with, of course, debilitating social economic consequences to boot. But what's unusual, of course, about this downturn is that it's caused entirely by government, basically, or at least largely by government. Now, normally unemployment is divided into three types. There's the frictional unemployment, which is workers moving between jobs. It obviously takes some time to get a new job. There is structural unemployment, where entire industries basically are phased out and so the workers can't find work. And then, of course, there's the cyclical unemployment, the waxing and waning of economic activity that, of course, ratchets employment up and down. But this type of employment, a kind of induced unemployment, we've never really seen before. It's been caused by regulation. So it is possible that it could vanish as quickly as it's emerged. It took years for the jobless rate to reach a peak of around 30% in the early 1930s during the Depression. But this time it's taken a few months to reach a peak, or even less, in fact, a matter of weeks. And the restrictions are, thankfully in my view, starting to end, and we've already seen this week in the ABS's payroll data that the decline in jobs appears to have already bottomed out. And various policies, such as those on tenancy agreements and options to defer loan repayments, will help businesses last during this period. And of course, if they can last, there's a good chance that a big chunk of those jobs that have temporarily, let's hope, vanished, will still be there on the other side. Of course, another reason to be more optimistic is that we are far, far richer than we were in the 1930s. We have vast welfare programs to cushion the blow of joblessness. And, very crucially, China is still hoovering up our resources. In the early 1930s, the price of our exports, and then it was mainly wool and wheat, butter and meat, they collapsed by half just in 2 years. Now this time, iron ore, the iron ore price rather, is even higher than was forecast in the December budget update. And some of this optimism has been born out of the stock market. So locally, blue chip stocks have risen about 21% since the bottom in March, and in New York, they're up 27%. So it seems at least some investors have a more optimistic outlook, certainly than they had in March. And, intriguingly, house prices in the city of Melbourne have not yet crashed. Indeed, they actually went up in April, which has surprised many, including me. There could even be some plus sides for productivity in the long run. While I'm no fan of long shutdowns, it's forced an experiment on the world that would never have been conducted. For 8 weeks or so now, my newspaper, and indeed many other businesses, has been produced entirely remotely. Now, for the newspaper, if it was a daily miracle of the past, it is even more so now. So businesses, especially those without much need for customer facing, I believe will realise they don't need to spend so much on floor space. They might also not need to spend so much on IT, and so therefore they will become more efficient. They'll be forced to. And indeed, on a more light note, there is a slim possibility that we won't even have a technical recession if the first quarter of this year ends up being slightly positive. Because of course the economy will bounce back in September and then you won't have the 2 quarters of negative growth. And if that does happen, we'll have to thank the great toilet paper stampede of 2020, which of course saw the biggest monthly growth in retail sales in March ever. So finally, what are my policy suggestions? Well, in recent weeks, talk of reform has dominated news media. And the usual suspects have been trotted out: tax reform, industrial relations reform, of course deregulation, and there's nothing wrong with any of these suggestions, but they have been around for a long time, and they still haven't been introduced. I do think the idea of a new era of cooperative politics is fanciful. And the government, this government, the federal government at least, certainly hasn't showed itself to be very interested in bold reform in recent years. I think that's fair to say. And given its slim majority in the parliament, which is not going to change, you can probably understand why. So most urgent for me is to reform the JobKeeper package. This is the $130 billion wage subsidy scheme, the most generous in the world, which was widely feted in late March when it was launched. Now, fund managers and surgeons and barristers on huge incomes, we've learned in the press only just this morning in the Financial Review, in fact, whose incomes dipped slightly in March, are now receiving JobKeeper. And they will, on current rules, continue to do so for 6 months. I think that is an extraordinary waste of public money, which I think by August or September will not be tolerated by the electorate. My final point, meanwhile, many thousands of poor workers with temporary visas, many of them effectively stuck in Australia, can't even apply for the program. And the situation, as I say, will sap confidence in the integrity of the welfare system. The government could fix this by imposing some sort of income tax surcharge on any sole traders or partnerships, say whose income was above $200,000 or some threshold, so that they would not bother applying for the payment in the first place. Our success against COVID opens up other economic opportunities too, assuming that we have indeed permanently defeated the virus, as many in Australia say is our aspiration. I half joked in a recent column that we could become a giant nursing home for the world's baby boomers. In the same way we sell visas to business people who have $1.5 million, we could sell them to wealthy older European and North Americans perhaps who want to live out their retirement without the threat of COVID. Perhaps we might also have better luck attracting regional offices of big multinational corporations, because their high-paid, skilled staff might not want to live in countries where COVID-19 is common. It's worth pointing out, though, as an aside, that there are costs of being COVID-free before a vaccine is found, such as forcing all Australians into 2 weeks quarantine every time they go overseas. In a way, we've effectively been imprisoned in a sense, at least temporarily. And certainly, we won't be having any tourists or business people visit this country under these current circumstances. And forming a tourism bubble with New Zealand, of course, won't be enough to compensate. Now, the Prime Minister has talked about a new industrial relations compact. It's certainly true, as Jared well knows, that our industrial relations system works against the public interest, and it's for many years been entrenching the power of unions and lawyers over workers and our long-term productivity. So greater simplicity of industrial awards, which are governing a larger and larger share of workers, seems very worthwhile, especially in the hospitality and retail sectors where we need to encourage those jobs to be recreated the most. As far as tax reform goes, I think personal income tax cuts that are legislated should be brought forward, the 2024 cuts I mean, they should be brought forward, just as former Treasurer Peter Costello and former Treasury Secretary John Fraser have said in recent weeks. If we need more revenue, we should look at scrapping compulsory super, which costs the federal government more than $30 billion a year in foregone tax. New South Wales and Victoria are seemingly determined to push ahead with their stamp duty and land tax reforms, and this is a very laudable idea, and I think especially the New South Wales Treasurer Dominic Perrottet does deserve a lot of credit for driving this. My final point, perhaps the most important reform though, is learning how to deal with a virus like this in a more targeted way for next time. It's been a failing of our leaders in my view that we have seemed so ad hoc. A pandemic like this is not a black swan, that is, it's not an event that we could not have reasonably foreseen. Yet it seems the preparation, including lack of ventilators and plans to quickly expand hospital capacity, were not in place. Certainly we will see more medical supply stockpiling and potentially even more local manufacture. On this topic, there's been speculation that we're seeing the end of globalization in some way. Well, my view is that this won't happen unless tariffs and regulations are reintroduced on a large scale, and I just can't see that happening. The desire for Australian, and indeed all firms, to shift their manufacturing to the cheapest location in the world will still be there. Finally, let's hope we don't face a pandemic threat like this for a half-century or more, given we have just spent a lot of our resources fighting this one. But given flu pandemics occurred in the late 50s, the late 60s, and then we had MERS, SARS, swine flu, Ebola, and now COVID, it's unfortunately likely that it will be much sooner than that. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Jared and Anne. It's really lovely to be back at the Sydney Institute, and a great pleasure to be experimenting with the new format inspired by the COVID crisis. As Adam has alluded to, at this point in time, we find ourselves in a deep economic hole. We have some metrics on how deep. The official unemployment rate is up to 6.2%. 1 million Australians are receiving the job seeker payment, and the underemployment rate is at a historic 13.7%. And the government estimates that 6 million employees will eventually receive JobKeeper. But we don't properly know whether it will get deeper. There is still doubt whether people who have the virus become immune, whether there'll be a second or third wave of infections, and whether the many businesses which have registered for JobKeeper will be viable in a post-lockdown world. One thing is for sure, there are plenty more rounds of bad news to come, perhaps on the health front, and certainly on the economic front. The upheaval is changing our habits, our expectations, and our aspirations. What will emerge out of this time is a new politics that responds to the ways in which society is changing. The shape it takes in Australia will depend largely on how the government and the opposition manage the risks and opportunities that will present themselves over the coming years. Excuse me. I'll discuss some of these risks and opportunities in a moment. But before I begin, I'd just like to take the moment to reflect on the pre-COVID political landscape. Even before COVID began to ripple across the world, political alignments were in flux. Social democracy was in decline as parties of the left were torn apart by intersectionalism, chasing the chimera of individual equality while establishing a hierarchy of victimhood inconsistent with equalisation. These parties have made themselves unpalatable to the traditional worker base. A small rump of genuine social democrats has been left behind in every nation, which ultimately grieves over the tatters of their once greater movement and tries to mend relations with the mainstream. But their efforts are nullified by the fringe elements within their parties. Meanwhile, the pre-COVID right was in the process of gouging out its own differences, finding and deepening rifts between the cosmopolitan free marketeers, conservatives, populists, and righteous reactionaries, each vying to foment contempt for the other among the voting public. The disunity on the right has not yet become toxic enough to completely alienate mainstream voters, so populist conservative alliances were able to win over voters that the left had abandoned. They did this largely by taking up the causes which social democrats had discarded in their great leap to the fringes. And so, as we slouched into 2020, the political landscape was already repolarising, a reorganisation that we can expect to see intensified as the world tries to find its way back to some kind of economic and epidemiological equilibrium. The Morrison government responded to the crisis in a way that has been judged proportionate by the majority of Australians and authoritative by the rest of the world. Its mistakes have been small by comparison with the size of the task, and some decisions were made early and well, like closing borders and insisting on quarantine for all returning citizens, while the World Health Organisation was still jabbering slogans about diseases not respecting borders. However, one thing is for sure. Every mistake that the government made at the peak of the crisis will be inflated by commentators and political opponents who possess the perfect information of hindsight. The conflicts of the pre-COVID era have not been erased, and they're already informing tribal views of how the crisis should have been handled. These disagreements becoming the handmaidens of existing conflicts and resentments. How we emerge from the pandemic and rebuild our economy will be coloured by the push-me-pull-me of these shifting political poles. So much for the context. Now let's look at how these things might unfold. There are three types of risks that the Morrison government will be managing: policy risks, political risks, and opportunity risks. I'll argue that the key to navigating them lies in emphasising the moral foundations that unite us. Firstly, policy risk. The $130 billion rescue package, unveiled by the Morrison government at the height of the crisis, is terrifyingly large. It's already heavily criticised for being out of all proportion to the challenge that COVID poses. The size of the package had a shock and awe effect which short-circuited some of the building hysteria among employers and employees. The message was quite unmistakable. The government understood the havoc the virus response had wrought on the economy and was not going to let blameless businesses go under or leave individuals without a livelihood. To begin with, the temporary safety net was gratefully received. Stable social democracies like Australia expect their governments to step in times of crisis. The breathtaking size of the package seemed to underscore the size of the challenge. The government's commitment to shepherding the economy through the crisis and the capacity of the Australian budget to support a response of this scale. Internationally, Germany and Australia were mentioned together as countries whose strong budget positions rendered them able to devote enviable resources to the twin challenges of COVID. But there were, of course, critics. Criticism from the left focused on the plight of the groups without access to the JobKeeper program, including government-funded universities and local councils, or without access to either the JobKeeper or the JobSeeker program, like international students and migrants on temporary visas. Meanwhile, a section of the right focused on the astronomical costs and trade-offs involved in shutting down the economy and putting over 70% of the population onto some form of welfare. These positions have bookended an interesting mainstream discussion about the nature of fairness. The conversation is allowing us to talk about the moral foundations of the wider Australian tax and transfer system and examine what we mean when we invoke fairness, proportionality, and mutual obligation. In The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt's book on how our moral intuitions guide our political leanings, the author proposes that there are 6 moral senses which act like the taste buds of the soul. Liberals, in the American usage of the word, and from now on I'll just say the left, have a slightly more limited moral palette than libertarians and conservatives, which I'll now on just call the right. But there are areas of morality which are universal across cultures and political tribes. Everyone, left, right and centre, likes caring and dislikes harm, likes liberty and dislikes oppression. And we also like proportionality and fairness, or people getting what they deserve, and reciprocity, which means people doing their bit. We like them to different amounts and with differing emphasis, and this underpins our political differences. But we all operate within a moral matrix that values proportionality and reciprocity, likes care and dislikes harm, likes liberty and dislikes oppression. Most of the time, the operation of our matrices within us is invisible to us. They're a framework from which we view the world, not an object of examination themselves. We rarely make our matrices explicit when we discuss policy. Rather, we tend to discuss policy as though our individual moral matrices were universal. The disruption caused by the pandemic has created a pocket of history in which we're suddenly able to talk about these policies morally, rather than tribally. The policies are too new and too undebated to have become tribal totems, and so we can examine them on merit. Interestingly, in this environment, even the Labor leader, whose default position is to reject mutual obligation, has been talking about proportionality. At a recent press conference, Anthony Albanese lamented that a single mother receives the same JobKeeper payment as a university student who is working a few hours a week. Some individuals have also questioned why they're receiving the full JobKeeper amount, and one columnist recounts the case of his 2 daughters, one of whom had been earning $200 a week for over a year in a casual job and was therefore eligible for the full payment, while the other, who'd started a more permanent job, earning a proper salary, found herself ineligible for the payment. Business owners have complained about employees who refuse to work now that they're receiving a mandated wage, and have remarked on the unfairness of a scheme which pays some employees more than they were earning before, while leaving those who are earning more with less. And trade businesses have recounted instances of apprentices who were eligible for JobSeeker, preferring this payment to the apprentice wage. For a brief moment at least, we are talking about the ethics of welfare. If the scheme is ever to be wound back, and it will have to be, It will be important to maintain this focus on the topic of social reciprocity, or mutual obligation, rather than the economic bottom line. The disruption and focus on reciprocity has also opened up the opportunity to discuss a number of other important policy areas: national sovereignty, immigration, globalism, shared identity, the intergenerational social bargain, employer-employee relations, corporate responsibility, and by that I mean the real thing, not the performative corporate social responsibility that we've all been palmed off of latterly, subsidies and economic rent, and many other topics from a moral vantage, using our shared matrices to examine ways that each of these things can be improved. There is a brief window before the rationally disengaged majority once again rationally disengages to discuss policy in a way that has previously been unavailable to us. If policies in these areas are allowed to become miscast as economic policies, we'll miss a once-in-a-100-year opportunity to understand each other and set our course for the 21st century. And that might sound like high-minded guff. So let's bring it back to something we know is rarely high-minded and talk about politics. The second set of risks of Morrison is distinctly political. Morrison narrowly won the election against Bill Shorten this time last year because he persuaded a party which had spent a decade talking about itself and waging internal culture wars to finally stop fighting for long enough to point out that jobs are important, as is self-sufficiency and budgetary responsibility, and that a vote for Bill Shorten put all of those things at risk. However, it would be naive to think that the Liberal Party culture wars are over, or that Morrison is protected against them just because he won an election by sidestepping them. As I mentioned earlier, the right is currently in the process of reorganising itself globally, and the stakes are high. If anything, the right wing of the Australian Liberal Party sees itself vindicated in removing a leader by Morrison's election win, and is relishing its power. Disunity, it's been said to me, is no longer dead. This means that Morrison is in constant danger from within his own party, and the right of the right has a new unifying cause here and around the world, ending the lockdowns and increasingly questioning the need for them in the first place has become a tribal rallying cry for Trump supporters and the AfD in Germany, and many commentators here. They may well be vindicated, but whether or not they are is immaterial politically. The fact is that these accusations have the potential to become a weapon wielded against the leader. Meanwhile, the Labor Party is too unthreatening to present a common enemy for the right to unite against. If the situation escalates, Morrison's strength will depend on the support of the quiet Australians of the mainstream. He'd better hope then that his moral arguments for his decisions in taking us into the lockdown and out again are widely understood and well understood. His reported response to the idea of accepting the deaths of elderly Australians in pursuit of herd immunity, not on my watch, resonated and can be considered a good start. Now he'll have to find an equally strong parole to carry us through the hard times to come. As Australia emerges from the crisis, Morrison will have to undertake reforms which he has previously deemed too risky, because we'll not be able to find our way back to the way things were. Too much has already changed. Businesses have died. They've been propped up by JobKeeper. Habits have changed. Our aspirations and expectations have shifted. Our concerns are different. Australia needs policy reform that will encourage and remove barriers to enterprise and entrepreneurialism that we need to regrow the economy as quickly as possible. And we need to find better ways to contribute to each other and strengthen Australia economically, socially and morally. We will need to maintain solidarity to face a changing world in which our friends, allies and trading partners are themselves challenged and challenging. So the third risk is inaction. If there is not a clear trajectory towards positive change, Morrison will struggle to defend another election. A government that works for people is not a government that gives them everything they want, but one that is in tune with the moral sentiment of the population and able to create a reform agenda founded on values rather than on an economist's utopia. The COVID pandemic has created conditions for this kind of reform agenda, by reminding us of our dependence on one another and our unity as a nation state. The way out of the pandemic lies in seizing that opportunity to unite us into a society that understands its moral foundations. Thank you.
So Adam and Parnell, thanks for stimulating talks, both 15 minutes each, which is exactly what we wanted. So we've got some questions from our members. I'm going to start with two of them, one to you, Adam, and one to you, Parnell. So Adam, the question is, will there be some jobs that won't return? And I think, as I recall, a year or so ago you wrote a piece in the Australian saying a lot of people had nothing jobs, that these jobs they thought they were doing didn't really exist because they were essentially talking to one another or writing papers to one another. So are those kind of jobs that you targeted as something that should be got rid of? I mean, will they return if you're in a big company and you're really not doing much that's productive? Will you come back, or will those jobs disappear?
Well, I think the phrase was actually bullshit jobs, Jared. I don't know if I'm allowed to say
bullshit jobs,
but it's a technical term actually now because the anthropologist David Graeber has made it so. But look, it's a really profound question, and I think one of the ironies of this, at least in the short term, is that you've seen a lot of jobs lost that are actually useful jobs. You know, stuff that has to be done in restaurants and hospitality and tourism, in retail sectors. And it's the corporate jobs, it's the office jobs, which more readily fit that description, which so far at least have survived because they can be done at home. You know, what actually done means, I think, is another issue. And I think a lot of large firms, as I mentioned in my speech, will actually, as the months and weeks go on, they're going to have to look at, who is worth their salary in these organisations. And I think if you're going to make cuts, surely it is going to be these jobs that will go first. And so I think in the short term, those jobs are safe. But in the long term, I think this is a real jolt to the economy that could see many of them phased out. Because just to stress the economic reason is because this work from home period really highlights who is producing what. Shorn of all of the face time in the office, what matters for the organisation, and that's going to become very stark.
So to some extent, these are termed in big companies back office jobs, in a sense.
Yeah, or social responsibility jobs. I don't know. PowerPoint production jobs. These sorts of jobs.
But these jobs pay quite well.
Well, that's one of the great ironies of those jobs, which I wrote in that column, is they do pay well.
And take them out of the economy, that'll have an impact, although it might be good for individual companies.
That's right. Although,
may I just weigh in on that question, because I do have a little bit of insight there. It doesn't look like those jobs are going anywhere, because they all have a word like strategy in the title. And nobody gets rid of a strategist in a crisis.
That's a good point.
So those jobs are looking, from where I'm sitting, sort of dealing with big businesses, quite safe.
What about the thought leaders? Are they okay?
Well, thought leadership, you still have an output that you can produce from home, right? So these kind of communication materials are still very visibly being delivered. It is some of the other jobs which, the frontline jobs which are disappearing because you can't perform them in certain ways.
So you reckon that the wellness departments are safe, are they?
The wellness departments are going to be working overtime, making sure that people's home offices are HR compliant.
I see.
I think there's some truth in what she's saying, yes, but it's just too early to know yet. I mean, it depends on how bad the downturn is. I mean, I was being a bit optimistic in my speech. I think that's kind of useful at the moment, actually. But if it's a really severe downturn, I don't know, there just won't be. I mean, notwithstanding this, there's going to have to be big cuts.
So going back to Parnell, around where you finished about a way out, and one of our members asked the question, in a sense, what if there is no way out? I mean, if there is no vaccine, which is a possibility within a year or 2 years, it's a possibility there's no vaccine. Is there no way out? Do we just continue with a partial lockdown, and what's the impact of that?
Well, I think that people will start finding their own way out. I mean, at every stage, the population has actually been ahead of the government in this. The population started locking itself down before there was a formal ruling on that. And it started, at least observationally, from what I can see around the streets and around Bondi and places like that, it started unlocking itself before the government had made the announcement that it was time to come out of your shell again. So I think that people will start moving back into the economy in ways that they can find to operate. There will be some things, however, that won't be able to be done in the same way. And of course, there'll be different fear levels. Some people are just going to be a lot more nervous for a lot longer, and that will change how some services are delivered and what people want.
So the impact, going back to you, Adam, as you said, you were optimistic, and there's good reason to be optimistic for psychological reasons, but as you know well, there is another side to this, and the question is, will we get back to anything near normal? If you take, for example, a restaurant, which will be limited, or to some extent it would seem about how many people can be there, or travel, which is going to be a huge problem, or people trying to get into lifts in offices if there's only one or two people allowed in the lift. I mean, the economic decline here could well continue, depending a bit on not so much the Commonwealth government, which, as you know, is trying to get things working as well as it can, but resistance from nervous state governments who, with their leaders and people in their health departments, worried that someone's going to die and they're going to get blamed for it.
Well, look, I think it's partly a function of just how long people are willing to put up with these measures. I think it's very clear at the moment there's an enthusiasm for lockdown generally and for the various measures. I think that's what polling shows, not just in Australia but around the world. But it's a question of how long that's going to last. And if people are frustrated with restrictions in lifts, or they can only go to restaurants where there's 10 people allowed. I mean, actually last night I went to my first restaurant in like 9 weeks, and I had to go to 4 different ones before there was a vacancy. So it is a great frustration. Look, I think that the fear of this virus was obviously very extreme back in March, and that's why everyone enthusiastically embraced all of these measures. But I think more and more people will come to see it that it's not as dangerous, and so therefore, at least for certain segments of the population, and so therefore they'll be less tolerant of these arbitrary restrictions, which would be good for the economy.
So what does that do to modelling? As you know, in relation to climate change, a lot of what people say government should be doing is based on modelling. It's a long way off to determine the accuracy of that modelling. But in relation to this virus, the modelling in places like Australia and New Zealand, where, as you make the point, probably essentially due to isolation and stopping international travel, the number of cases, number of deaths have been low. But even in places like Britain and the United States, it seems that the estimates of the death toll from the virus seem to be higher than otherwise would have been. So how is this going to affect modelling and how we regard modelling, that is, those of us who are aware of the concept of modelling?
Well, just briefly, I think it's a public relations disaster for modelling, and I imagine the climate change advocates will be very frustrated by this experience, because in the eyes of the general public, they just see modelling and they just see that it's been shown to be ridiculous, and so they'll just transfer that over to climate change.
Right. And that's part of that sort of political conflict that I think is going to be building in all of this, is that, as you say, at first the people who had been talking a lot about climate change modelling and resting their arguments on similar modelling to what we've seen in this pandemic were saying, isn't this wonderful? Now we're relying on experts. Now, if that flips the other way, and it turns out the experts here did not know what they were talking about and have led us into poverty, then of course the whole discussion about experts and modelling is going to be flipped on its head, and the climate change modellers are going to find themselves having to explain themselves very, very clearly.
It might even find politicians stop using the word modelling. It could become so embarrassing. I mean, it's too early to say yet, but certainly it's going to sink in that these models were hopeless.
But I think one of you mentioned, I think it might have been you, Adam, that some of the modellers look back on the Spanish flu of a century ago, and as you know, in Australia, the official figure, I think, of deaths is 12,000. It's estimated, it's regarded that that's a bit low, and it was probably 15,000, which in contemporary Australia with an added population would be something like 75,000 dead, and at the moment we're at 100, and it may go higher, but and then of course modelling has assumed a second wave, which may or may not occur. so those who were proclaiming the models, and of course Norman Swan at the ABC was one of the leading figures going public with these kind of projections. You think that'll translate across to climate?
Yeah, look, I think it will a little bit, and it's obviously much harder with climate because the results are so far away, many decades or even century away.
Yeah.
Whereas with this, you find out within months, basically. And that's what makes modelling so fraught, I think, with these viruses. But there's a history which has not been widely reported, and I think the media generally has not served us well throughout this crisis. Of these models of disease spread being grossly exaggerated. I mean, this almost happens every single time.
Yeah.
And yet they were taken this time at face value and policies enacted. And you just got to ask, why wasn't the media more loudly saying back in March, well, hang on, this guy, what is it, Neil Ferguson at Imperial, he has a strong track record, which I only found out this week. And I'm relatively well informed. I found out this week that he had a track record of gross exaggeration over 10 years. Yet this formed the justification of the British government. I mean, amazing.
Well, I think in Britain, in relation to one of these animal outbreaks, he predicted, well, they had to slaughter 6 million animals. And
this is mad cow. Is this the mad cow?
Yeah, I think it's mad cow. And they probably needed to slaughter about 600. But he's still going, he's still an expert, although he's got...
Of course, he didn't abide by his own rules.
Yeah, he's got a certain problem with wanted visitors, I think. So let's go back to the issue of, I think you raised it, and there's one of our members have come in with a question about the difference between the public sector and the private sector, because, Parnell, you were talking a bit about this in a certain sense, because, as you know, you've got a situation where decisions have essentially been made by elected politicians, but very much advised by non-elected health experts. And down in Victoria, you mentioned, Adam, there was a suggestion that the Victorian government had enacted on behalf of, the way the health department in Victoria told it to, there would have been 35,000 people dead, which looked like another massive exaggeration. So you've had this situation where public service advising politicians implementing rules and regulations, which are then enforced by a police force or local council rangers. So you've got, in a sense, the public sector telling essentially the private sector that they can't go out whilst people in the public service are going out to tell people they must stay in. Is this going to exacerbate these kind of differences that you referred to?
I think that there are a lot of public-private sector differences which have been highlighted by this. Yes, there is the sort of the strange images we saw of police standing this far away from the people who they were telling to social distance. I think also, of course, what you've seen is people whose jobs are absolutely not at risk by lockdown regulations, making decisions without really fully appreciating how they were going to be felt across the economy, how they were going to, perhaps, I mean, not even appreciating the web that is the economy, that if one person loses their job, that has a ripple effect across the entire economic web that's around them. You know, it's not only that we're not going into the office anymore, the dry cleaner is not getting dry cleaning anymore, the coffee shop isn't selling coffees anymore. There are a whole lot of real jobs which have depended on our existing way of doing things. And so with a stroke of a pen, which from a public service perspective can be done from home, they've eradicated all of these jobs. And I think there's a huge amount of resentment about that, apart from anything else. This is, I think, something I didn't mention in my speech, but I have talked about elsewhere, that I have heard a lot of anger against the public servants who were sort of talking from on high about how people should behave in all of this, while not understanding the economic impact that they were having on people.
I think it's really, if I can just add something, I think it's really highlighted the value of tenure in a job, and a lot of public service jobs, you're not readily sacked. I mean, in theory you can be, but it very rarely happens. There's been this argument for decades that we have to pay, say, top public sector leaders the same as people in the private sector, and that's indeed happened. Indeed, you could argue it's actually gone further in some cases, but of course that completely ignores that when there's a crisis, the person in the public sector is going to keep their income, and that is extraordinarily valuable, whereas the person in the private sector may not. And that would explain the old distinction why you might earn a lot more in the private sector, because there was some more risk entailed. So I think it shows the wrong-headedness of paying our department heads $900,000 a year, which is increasingly the standard, and it certainly never used to be. And I think there was valid questions to be asked about that now. But more broadly, Parnell is exactly right. I mean, you've had people making decisions who don't face any personal cost. Indeed, if you want to be cynical, they actually benefit from the shutdown, because by keeping their big salary, they've moved higher up in the social pecking order, right? As other people lose their jobs. And if asset prices fall, as they probably still will, you can pick up assets more cheaply. Anyway, that's very cynical, but that's the reality.
Yes, and Parnell's suggestion is people will become more conscious of this. You go back to the Great Depression. I wasn't around then, believe it or not. I wasn't, but I've read a bit about it. And we had a more regulated industrial relations system then, although it's still pretty regulated now. And there was, as I recall, across the board cuts of 10%, and then there was another 10% due to automatic increases not implying. And there was, of course, some deflation as well, but there was some sense that everyone in the society made some kind of contribution. Although if you were in the public service, as you were saying, Adam, with a secure job, losing 20% or 10% wasn't a great deal if you were coming back, and if you're in the private sector, it was different. But there was some degree of sharing. What we've got the situation now, as far as I can see, is that those in the public sector don't appear to have had any problems with employment or wage reductions, and those in the private sector many of them have been decimated, particularly entrepreneurial people working in restaurants or setting them up, or dry cleaners and these sort of essentially small business or franchise businesses. They've really copped it. So is there an argument for a perception that there is a greater sharing of the burden here?
Yeah, I think there should be, and I think New Zealand's Prime Minister did a good job. She cut her salary and her ministers by 20% for the duration of the lockdown. I think that's very good politics, A, and B, it's also a fair and reasonable thing to do. I've been really surprised here, very disappointed by the federal government for really ignoring this question. I mean, all they've done is just defer a 2% pay rise as the big sharing the burden. I mean, that's laughable. But, if you're on 500,000 or 800,000, you wouldn't even notice 2% anyway. It's like hardly sharing the burden.
Well, just correct me for a second. The people on 500 or 800,000 are actually the public servants.
Well,
the
cabinet ministers are on
cabinet, the basic politicians.
Yeah, basic politicians on 250 or something like that. Which is still that's a big salary in the big scheme of things. A lot of MPs forget they're actually very well paid. They're constantly associating with corporate elites who earn more than them.
Well, that's true. But some of them don't have secure jobs because
yes, that is true. That is true.
Whereas the public servants these days, there are some exceptions, but your jobs are pretty secure for a long term out.
They are, and I hope the coalition will use this as an opportunity to reform some of these disparities between pay.
Look, I can't comment on the disparities in pay, but I would say that it would have been nice to see a bit more skin in the game through saying, okay, for the duration of the lockdown, while we are forcing Australians onto the dole queue, we are going to take more of a hit. I know that the Singapore government actually did this really early in the piece. So even at the end of February, as soon as it realised that it was going to require sacrifices of its people, the government cut their salaries for the couple of months at the time. I'm not sure if they've done it since then. But also Singapore Airlines immediately, the CEO took a pay cut for the time being. So there was a sort of symbolic upfront, we are in this with you message that they were sending out that I thought was quite important to how Singaporeans responded at that point.
We've done a bit of that at the top end of town, but it hasn't really run across. Going back, a couple more questions. People are interested in what we might do with reviving manufacturing industry, but I think as you were saying, Adam, that'd be pretty difficult with the current regulations, and including industrial relations regulations.
It is very difficult. I mean, the only thing that might help it is our exchange rate has fallen a great deal recently. 65 cents or something at the moment, which is below the long-term average. It's certainly fallen a lot over the last 12 months. That's obviously going to make us a cheaper place to shift manufacturing. But if you're a big multinational, you make these decisions over 5-10 year timeframes or more. Our currency could go up again. They don't know. So therefore, you wouldn't shift production based on that. You'd only shift it if governments, as I said, were going to introduce tariffs in somewhat permanent fashion. And I just don't see them doing that. So therefore, the incentive to shift to the cheapest location isn't going anywhere. So I don't see how this, and it's a romantic ideal. And look, I would love more manufacturing in Australia. Absolutely love it. It's like stable, well-paid jobs. But I just don't see in practice how you get it back.
Well, to be fair, they have been talking about advanced manufacturing, sort of high-value goods. And where the gap seems to be is the fact that we actually don't have enough skilled people to be delivering on those jobs at the moment. So one of the things that big businesses have been doing that I think, from a moral perspective, they need to look at correcting is they've been bringing in people from overseas to do jobs at a level which is normally the apprentice entry level, which sees them then learning the jobs to do the advanced manufacturing or highly skilled sort of work that in the trade side of things. So Australia does have an opportunity to improve on that, but it will need to be through business understanding that there is a new way that it has to relate to the Australian population and a new way that that it needs to invest in Australian people as well as land and and the profits of sales here.
One of our members, who's a farmer, sent a note saying at a TAFE, a technical college in one of the major states, she could sign up to do diplomas or whatever it is in certain beauty treatments and whatever else, but she can't sign up to do plumbing.
Yeah.
So this obviously is a problem for state governments. They run the TAFE system, but how do we move back to a situation where we're doing more what used to be TAFE courses within TAFE courses rather than what's developed in TAFE courses in many states in recent years, where they're going beyond what was usually the technical focus of these courses?
It's a hard question, and I'm not a huge expert in the higher education area, but I do see that vocational education has been a disaster in Australia on the policy front now for a decade, and something has to change. It's been rorted to pieces, I think, by many private operators taking advantage of federal government subsidies, and this has all been well reported. Maybe the huge shock to the higher education sector in terms of loss of foreign students, which of course affects universities, but also the VET sector, will in the long run be a good thing. It's certainly in the short run not a good thing for those institutions, but it may force them to focus more on domestic students, which, given their origin in government is or should be a high priority, whereas it's certainly not at the moment, at least at the universities. It's definitely not. It's about charging as much money as possible to as many foreign students to ensure you can have hundreds of pro vice chancellors on $400,000 a year. That's basically the model. No, slightly facetious, but that's
it's not untrue.
It's also there is going to be a high rate of youth unemployment over the next year or two. We can already see that coming through. I think one of the opportunities that lies ahead of us is the opportunity to look at systems around the world that have dealt very well with that. One of those is the Swiss model, which starts apprenticeships during school but sees them as part of a career path. So you start a vocational trade. About half of people go to university straight out of school. The rest go on to learn a trade, then might go on to university or technical college later on. But as a result, the Swiss unemployment rate is, I think the overall unemployment rate is around 3.4%, and youth unemployment is 0.5% higher.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so a couple of other issues that were raised. As you both know, this has been a country of high immigration, some would say very high immigration in recent decades, going back really to the end of the Second World War. Now it looks like, as you both mentioned, there's going to be an artificial endorsed decline in immigration. What kind of impact is that going to have on the economy? I mean, there is an argument that immigrants were taking jobs, that'll be tested now.
Yes, that's true. Look, it's going to be a very interesting experiment, actually, one that we wouldn't have chosen. Although, of course, some people will be very happy about this, I might add, and I kind of respect their arguments. We have had very high immigration, the highest in the Western world, basically. 1.5% a year, and the vast bulk of it, of course, is net overseas migration. It's going to have a huge effect on headline GDP, and it's going to mean that we have a lot more recessions, if you like, because the only reason we've had, well, the main reason, overwhelmingly, that we had that 28 years that we kept hearing about was because of high immigration. If you look at per capita terms, we've had 3 or 4 recessions, if you like, in that period. So those per capita recessions will become actual recessions, and it's going to be very embarrassing for the political class, I think, because they can't rely on immigration anymore. It's going to have a huge impact on the property sector, huge. I mean, dwelling prices you'd think will fall, and rents are going to collapse. And this is all just starting to play out now, I think. So I think it's going to have a profound impact. You could argue, kind of after the lockdown measures themselves, this is the biggest change our economy is going to endure. Look, I'm kind of on the fence as to whether it's a good or bad thing. I used to be, pro huge population, but I'm starting to see that there are problems with that.
Well, I mean, let's not forget Australia has always had one of the best managed immigration systems. So I do see a big positive in being able to bring immigrants with the sort of caveats that Australians have in the past. But I think this is possibly the opportunity to look at where companies have brought them in for those lower paid roles that I was mentioning before, that then take the opportunity from an Australian kid to get on the first rung of the employment ladder or an apprenticeship career or whatever they are away, and instead focus on high-skilled immigrants, at least for we have said that we always focused on high-skilled immigrants. The truth of the matter is, however, they're about a third of the program, and the rest is a lot of, is made up through university visas being allocated, becoming paths to citizenship and so on, and not always high-quality university education. So it's not like we're training up great people who then become Australian citizens. So I think we need to look at some of those areas, but absolutely we should, a lot of our prosperity does come from immigration, and so we do need to look at how we can fix the immigration program to ensure we are still benefiting from that, and people who want to come here and contribute to our society are still benefiting as well.
So I'm going to ask you a final question in a minute, which only requires a one-word answer. But before we do, one of our members, the last one I haven't covered, is the concept of resources. Now, I noticed that on Q&A the other night there was sort of voices from the audience who were a virtual audience that any kind of recovery, any government involvement should throw virtually all or most of its money at alternative energy resources. So how goes, we've spoken about the climate change debate and modelling, but what about the current debate about energy? How does that fit in a post-pandemic environment?
Well, I guess the first observation is that if we're poorer, if there's a recession, high energy costs are going to be felt more keenly. And so there'll be more frustration at high cost of electricity in this country, which, as we know, is now amongst the most expensive in the world, from amongst the cheapest 20 years ago. So that's been a colossal policy failure. And rightly or wrongly, people do associate that extraordinary increase with a lot of this renewable energy push. And, the debate about it is incredibly vicious, as you know, although not as vicious as the debate about lockdown. that's definitely pipped it at the post. But I think the notion that Australia can have 100% solar and wind power, even in 2050, is based on, a reasonable assessment of science and technology is ludicrous. And there's no country in the world that's getting anywhere near that. Even Germany, which something about, they are furthest ahead in this. And as far as I know, it's becoming increasingly considered a failure.
Yeah.
So just spell that out a bit. Germany?
So Germany has been transitioning away from nuclear for a while, since Fukushima.
They have a word for it, don't they? Some very long word for the transition.
Yes, but it's not going to come to me right at this instant. But essentially, McKinsey wrote a report, I think sometime last year, at the end of last year, which assess the progress of the transition to renewable energy, and basically framed it after 30 years, as Germany has about 30% of its energy coming from renewable energy. The withdrawal from nuclear is going to cause a huge problem. It's causing greater reliance on coal now. Despite all of the sort of rosy projections of the renewable energy advocates, realists looking at this don't see how the renewable energy sector is going to make up for the energy taken out by the by the nuclear sector. And a lot of the renewable energy that is being provided is coming from biomass, which is considered reasonably environmentally friendly.
So biomass is burning wood.
Chopping down trees.
That's right, chopping down trees and these sort of things. So essentially, it doesn't look like a technology at this stage that we could simply say, great, all right, we're going to put a lot of investment into this and it will be fine. We'll have enough of it by 2050 as long as we invest enough so that we don't need any other kinds of energy. It frankly, to me, does not look like that at this stage. I think a much greater opportunity at this point would probably be to say, okay, since we're in a moment of reviewing all the regulations and subsidies and seeing if, what needs to be there or not, let's take them away from energy and see which of these energy sources people genuinely want to invest their private sector money in without the subsidies from government. And also, perhaps at the same time we look at economic rents on other types of energy.
So in conclusion, our topic was coming out of the lockdown, or getting towards the end of the pandemic. Your experience in economics business, optimistic or pessimistic?
Look, I was optimistic in my speech, and so I'm going to stick to that theme. I just want to say it's not going to be a 1930s type experience. It's going to be better than that.
Pardon?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be as bad as the 1930s. I think that as Adam was saying, we're healthier, we're wealthier to begin with. We've got a number of things going for us, but in a way, it's up to us from here. It's up to us whether we get this right or we completely stuff it up.
So thanks to our members for sending in questions. Thanks to you both for great talks and a terrific discussion. Well done.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you.